Okay, so good morning everyone. Today we're going to be studying from Daniel 11. There's Daniel 10 too, but we're not going to specifically study Daniel 10 because while there's good material in Daniel 10, I think most of it's fairly straightforward. The one thing that I would like to take out of Daniel 10 is that when Daniel was in prophetic communication with heaven, when he was receiving a vision, he didn't breathe. And it says so in Daniel chapter 10. And this is something that we should contemplate today, because everywhere in the world today, there's people who are claiming to be prophets. But a true prophet of God is something that is very special. So we should bear that in mind in these last days. So for Daniel 11, we're going to use this booklet, which is put out by Behold Your God Ministry, and it's on Daniel 11 in today's world. That's particularly what we want to talk about, today's world. But we will also look at some history, because there's history that's connected with an understanding of Daniel 11 in today's world. So unless we have some sort of understanding of that history, we won't understand the symbolism that is in Daniel 11 from verse 40 and onwards. So it's Daniel 11 in today's world, end time prophecy. Northern powers, southern powers symbolise modern powers in today's world. How will they affect the true followers of Jesus? So that is the front cover of the book, and that sums up what this is about. So we're going to hear about northern powers, and southern powers as we study this prophecy. And these are symbols of nations or groups of nations or philosophies and ways of doing things. So God, in his great and infinite wisdom, wanted to bring out in prophecy to divide those who were fighting against him into two main groups. And so he used northern powers and southern powers. And then as well we have the people of God as well, which is the third power, and this is the followers of Christ. But they are not so prevalent in this chapter. Now, I'd just like to begin by reading from Revelation and chapter 11 and verse 18. And here we read, "And the nations were angry, and thy wrath is come, and the time of the dead, that they should be judged, and that thou shouldest give reward unto thy servants the prophets, and to the saints, and them that fear thy name, small and great. So this is the time in which we're living, when the nations are angry. And this time, where the nations have been angry, began when the time of the end began in 1798. But we will look at this date later on to understand this more. So we're living in the time when the nations are angry. And since 1798, there's been 2 major world wars and many smaller wars that have been fought out on this earth. So, I'd like now to show you a picture of the area around where Israel is, because this helps us to focus on the king of the north and the king of the south. So we'll bring this picture up to the camera, and you'll see that Israel is in the middle in the yellow, and that the king of the north is in green, and the king of the south is in red. And this prophecy is given in relation to Israel initially. So the king of the north came to Israel from the north, and the king of the south came to Israel from the south. And so in this we have an understanding of where these terms, king of the north and king of the south, come from. But today, this geographical method of understanding who the king of the north and the king of the south are no longer works. We have to have a spiritual application. So we read on page 3 of this book, in olden times the king of the north came from the north to Israel, where most of God's people with the scriptures were located. Likewise, the king of the south came to or through Israel from the south. They represented systems that were antagonistic to each other. They also repressed Israel, where God's people who had the prophecies of Daniel were mostly located. In today's world, at the time of the end, the Lord expects us to understand that God's people are spiritual Israel, not physical Israel. Although Jews can be a part of spiritual Israel today. The kings of the north and the south we also are to see as not coming from a particular geographical location. Instead, we are to look for the type of spirit behind these systems that made them what they were in God's eyes. How did they treat Jesus himself, his disciples and the followers throughout the ages? How shall they treat spiritual Israel, his people in the last days? The answer to these questions is there in Daniel 11, if we take the effort to understand what the Lord is warning us of. We need to make the correct preparation for these events, which is a character preparation, a character made like Jesus through his inner working. So we want to see that God's way is the ultimate preparation for these end times, to be a part of the people who represent the character of God as revealed in the life of Jesus. Okay, so we'll continue now on page 8 of this booklet, and the chapter is Geographical to Spiritual. So God has a way of beginning with a geographical location, and that geographical location is showing us certain things about the philosophy, about the way of life, etc., of those people. For instance, there was a Babylon which existed, and that Babylon that existed back in Daniel's day was a real power. There really was a Babylon, and that Babylon had a certain spirit that we can recognize in the scriptures and in the writings of the people who lived in Babylon. So King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, was given a dream. And in that dream, he saw this image. And in the image, as we have looked at earlier in the studies on Daniel, we have a head of gold. And God told King Nebuchadnezzar that that head of gold was him and his empire. You are the head of gold. But what did King Nebuchadnezzar do? He created an image which was from head to feet, all gold. And he asked, he told, he demanded that every person in his empire would bow to that golden image. And by doing that, he was saying in effect, my kingdom will last forever. What God has said is not true through his prophet Daniel. What I'm saying is true, that my kingdom will last forever, and that everyone must operate according to my principles forever. And I will be the ruler to make sure they do. And those who wouldn't bow to his kingdom principles and to his will would be thrown into the burning fiery furnace. A death sentence was waiting there for them. And that is Babylon. That is Babylon that takes what God has said would happen, that takes God's information, what God has talked about, and turns it into their own way of thinking. So they start with something that's true and they turn it into a lie. Because what Nebuchadnezzar did was a lie. And so this is the spirit of Babylon. It's a deception. It takes something that's good and gives us good information and turns it into something that is not good, that is deceiving. And so if you were deceived into thinking that Babylon would last forever, you would be in a lot of misunderstanding, because next was to come Medo-Persia, then was to come Greece, then Rome, and more and more. So we want to see that geographical interpretation is not reliable because there is no physical Babylon today. If you go to Iraq, where Babylon was located, you will find that there is no city there. Now, Saddam Hussein wanted to rebuild Babylon and make a great empire again in that site, but his plans were destroyed, as the Bible has said that they would be. There's no Babylon, there never will be a physical Babylon again. But when we read in Revelation in particular about the end times, we read about Babylon over and over and over again. So we need to understand that Babylon is a system, a way of thinking, a way of acting, like I've just mentioned from the illustration of the image. And when we get that fixed in our mind, we will be able to understand what Babylon the Great will be at the end of time. Let's take another example. And if we read from Revelation 2, verse 20, which is found in this booklet on the same page, we'll see that God mentions that woman Jezebel. So, in the book of Revelation, God is coming back to Elijah's time in Bible history, which was a long way before the book of Revelation was even written. And God is using the woman Jezebel, who persecuted God's people, who destroyed the true prophets and the true people in the kingdom. And she was the wife of Ahab, king of Israel. But her origin was that her father was Ethbaal, king of the Zidonians, and they were Baal worshippers who also offered human sacrifices. So God takes that character, that name, and he puts it in the book of Revelation. And when he does that, it's not because there was a Jezebel that stood out at that time, a person called Jezebel. No, it was a system that was like the system of Jezebel back in the days of Elijah. So let's read from Revelation chapter 2, verse 20. Notwithstanding, I have a few things against thee, because you suffer that woman Jezebel, which calleth herself a prophetess, to teach and seduce my servants to commit fornication, and to eat things sacrificed unto idols. So in the time that it's speaking about there was a group of people or a system that was teaching in the same way that Jezebel did. And that is something that God had against his church, that they allowed that Jezebel system to be developing around them. Let's take another example, because this is such an important point. And it's a point where a lot of people will fail to understand when it comes to studying the last days. And if you don't understand this, you will be making all sorts of false moves, and because of that lack of understanding. So another example is Israel. So today, well, let's put it, there was a man called Israel in the Bible. and he was a very prominent man. And then there was the people, Israel, who were named after Israel the man. Okay, so there was an Israel person who was God's particular person at a particular time. And then the nation was called Israel. And then there is Israel, the spiritual children today, who are mentioned also in Revelation. So let's read what Paul says about this in Romans 9, verse 6. Not as though the word of God had taken none effect, for they are not all Israel which are of Israel. So in Paul's time, not everyone was truly Israel who was of Israel's descent. In other words, there was physical Israel and there was spiritual Israel, as he is going to explain. Verse 7, neither because they are the seed of Abraham are they all children, but in Isaac shall thy seed be called. That is, they which are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted for the seed. So today, the children of Israel can be God's people, no matter which nation they belong to, as is true in the day of Paul. So Paul was saying that the real people of Israel, to whom the promises will be fulfilled, could come from any part of the world, any part of the Gentile world, any part of the Israel that then was. Now today, spiritual Israel can live in Greenland, they can live in Africa, they can live in the Amazon jungle, they can live here in Australia, they can live anywhere in the world. But if they have that connection with God through Christ, then they are spiritual Israel. And in this way we can show that if we follow a geographical interpretation only, that we are going to come into some strange ideas when we study the book of Revelation. Because there is no Babylon. There is an Israel today, a physical Israel. And so many people, when they see about Israel, they think that God is going to rebuild Jerusalem and make it the centre of his work before his second coming. But God is talking about Jerusalem as a spiritual Jerusalem too. And so we have Jerusalem, the city, Jerusalem, the people, Jerusalem, the spiritual children, and Jerusalem, the coming city, which will be after Christ's return, after the end of the 1,000 years. So with that, I think we can begin Daniel 11 now with that understanding. So let's go to page 10 of this booklet, or to Daniel 11 verse 1. And we're not going to study all the history that's in here, because we could be here for 3 weeks studying all this history. So we're just going to give some beginning to it to capture your interest, and you can study it yourselves in your own time. So let's read verse 1. Also I, in the first year of Darius the Mede, even I, stood to confirm and strengthen him. And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far greater than they all. And by his strength, through his riches, he shall stir up all against the realm of Grecia. So this is the angel Gabriel who's giving this information. And it goes on to say that the next event in verse 3 is that a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion and do according to his will. So this is Alexander the Great. So in these 4 verses, 3 verses, we see that we've gone right through from the beginning of the Medo-Persian Empire right through to the end. And then we're in the time of Alexander the Great. So let's read verse 2 now again. And it says, And now will I show thee the truth. Behold, there shall stand up yet 3 kings in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than they all. So the next one is Xerxes. And by his strength, through his riches, he will stir up all against the realm of Grecia. So Cyrus, these are the 3 kings. Cyrus was the first king, and then Cambyses, his son, and then Smerdis and Darius Hystaspes. And the 4th would be Xerxes, who was the richest of them all and amassed a huge army against Greece. Herodotus, a historian of the time, puts this army at 5.5 million, but this figure is disputed today. However, this huge force, whatever it was, had only limited success against the Greeks, and it was forced to withdraw. So when we looked at the Persian Empire in the statue vision that we've already studied, we see that the Persian and Medo-Persian Empire lasted from 539 to 331 BC. So it was a long empire, but in 2 verses we cover it. And now we begin to study the Grecian Empire. So then, after the Persians went against the Greeks with this huge army, however many was in it, they failed to really beat the Greeks with this huge army. In fact, it was a bit of a failure. And they certainly made enemies of the Greeks. Verse 3, And a mighty king shall stand up, that shall rule with great dominion, and do according to his will. And this mighty king is Alexander the Great. And he had 4 generals, as we spoke about in another study. 4 main generals, and Alexander the Great died at a very young age, as we'll read in the next verse. And the 4 generals took over from him. There was actually more generals than that, but there were 4 main ones who emerged. So verse 4, and when he shall stand up, his kingdom shall be broken, and shall be divided toward the four winds of heaven. So here we have the four coming up. The four generals is talking about divided towards the four winds of heaven. In another prophecy, in Daniel 7, I think it is, we have the four leopard heads, who are those same generals. So, and not to his posterity. So, the kingdom didn't go to Alexander the Great's sons or his family. He had two sons apparently, and neither of them survived because they were murdered. And these generals established themselves rather than Alexander the Great's sons. So Alexander the Great was only 34 years old when he died. Different people seem to say different things about how he died, but the one that I heard first is that he died of blood poisoning from drinking too much alcohol in an alcohol drinking contest when he was 34 years old. But the fact that he died at 34, I think, is pretty common belief. Okay, so it would be divided toward the four winds of heaven, and not to his posterity or to his children, nor according to his dominion which he ruled. For his kingdom shall be plucked up, even for others besides those. So, the four generals we know to be Lysimachus, Cassander, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. You'll find this on page 10, this information. So this is where we begin to get the king of the north and the king of the south from. So basically, Ptolemy ruled in Egypt, which was to the south of Palestine, and the Seleucid Empire ruled in the north. Not totally in the north, but they had to come from the north to enter into Jerusalem, into Judea. They were to the north, but they were to the northeast and the northwest as well. The Seleucid Empire was the biggest. So they were the king of the north. Another interesting point is that the old city of Babylon lay within the boundaries of the Seleucid Empire. Now Cassandra and Lysimachus, their kingdoms were absorbed by mostly the Seleucid kingdom. And so instead of four, eventually there was only two. The king of the north and the king of the south. And Rome also, when it emerged in the Seleucid Empire, king of the north, from the north. So we have, this is the where the king of the north and the king of the south come from, those terms which God has given us, northern powers and southern powers. So God, when he gives these things, he uses a geographical beginning, but it shows a certain spirit that is in these places. And from this we can learn what the spirit of those places is. So now let's go to page 20 in this book. Now if you study the the history that I haven't covered, you'll find names like Julius Caesar come up in the history there, Cleopatra, Mark Antony, and people like that. Augustus, Caesar Augustus, who was the Caesar at the time of Christ, who was the great tax collector. A good place to find this history is in the book Daniel and the Revelation by a man called Uriah Smith. Uriah Smith, who lived in the 1800s, and he wrote quite a good history on that part of the prophecy. Maybe not everything he wrote is correct. So that's a good place to follow right through that history, and you can learn a lot from reading about that in that book. And I acknowledge that I got the information on this history from that book, a lot of it anyway. But where Uriah Smith goes into the future from his time, it's quite unreliable, because he uses the geographical, Uriah Smith uses the geographical interpretation all the way through. But we want to use the spiritual interpretation. And that's why I spent so long in the beginning to explain this. Otherwise, it's impossible to understand what's going to happen in the prophecy as we go through. So we're going to go now to page 20, and this chapter is entitled The Time of the End. And verse 40. But I can see that we're going to have to go through 2 studies to cover this booklet, to study this chapter. So I want to talk a bit more about, because we're going to be talking about this, about the time of the papal supremacy. Because in order to understand this prophecy, we have to understand what is the time of the end. And if we go to Daniel 11, verse 40, it reads, "At the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen and with many ships. And he shall enter into the countries and shall overflow and pass over." So understanding when the time of the end begins is very important. So we want to go into that a bit first, I think. Otherwise, we can't prove when this chapter is starting. So it says, at the time of the end. Now, we talked about the day-year principle. In our previous studies, that in Bible prophecy, one day is standing for a year. And we get this from Numbers 14:35 and Ezekiel 4:6. And in the Bible prophecy, we have this time period of 1,260 days of papal supremacy. And that begins in 538 AD and it goes through to 1798 AD. And this is a very significant time prophecy. And that began with the decree of Justinian, which allowed the Pope to take power in Rome in 538 AD. And that papal power ruled Europe from Rome to the largest extent for that whole time period of 1,260 years. And at the end of that time, the French general Berthier, under Napoleon Bonaparte, took the Pope captive. So the Pope was taken captive. In 1798, and it lost a lot of its power when that happened. Now this time period is spoken about in a lot of different places in the Bible. The first one is Daniel 7 verse 25, and there it is called a time, times, and dividing of time. Okay, in Daniel 12:7, it's time, times, and a half. So we've got Daniel 12:7 is almost the same, but it's this, here it says it's a half a time. In Revelation 11 verse 2, we have 42 months. So Revelation 11:2, it's 42 months. In Revelation 13:5, Revelation 13:5, it's 42 months. 42 months again. In Revelation 11 verse 3, it's 1260 days, which is years. And in Revelation 12 verse 6, it's 1260 days or years. Now all these are talking about the same power, and you can look this up over the next week as your homework and look up all these Bible verses. You'll see it's talking about the same power, that this would go on for that time period. Now, a time. How long is a time? Well, from this period here, and seeing it's the same power that's mentioned every time, we can know that it should be 1,260 years. So if we take a time as being 360, And where do we get 360 from? Well, we get 360 because we have 365 and a quarter days per year. But there's been some change since the creation. It seems that when things were created, in God's eyes, a year is 360 days. And it may have been at the flood that the sun was dimmed at the time of the flood. And it may be that the time of a year changed. But however it is, in Bible prophecy, a year is 360. So we have a time, with them plus times. And times is 2 times. So we have 720 plus dividing of time is 180. And you add those up and it adds up to 1260. So both these are the same, where you have that. Okay, time, times, and dividing of time. Then 42 months is 42 months times 30. So what's 42 times 30? It's 1260. And then we have the last two, which are just straight 1260. So God has made this an important time period. Now, this marks an important time for God's people, because during this 538 to 1798, the Bible was not allowed to be printed by the Roman Catholic Church. They banned the Bible during that time. The Protestants printed Bibles from the early 1500s onwards, but the Bible was not was repressed by the papal power. And when the Pope was taken captive and that power was fully broken, then the Bible from that time went throughout the world. The Bible has gone everywhere since that time. But during the 1260 years, it says that the Bible prophesied in sackcloth and ashes. In sackcloth and ashes. In Revelation 18. So the truth became known much more widely since 1798. That's why it's called the time of the end, when the end can come, because God's people have the equipment, they have the Bible, they also have freedom, relative freedom. We have more freedom to think and to act today than we've ever had in the past. But this freedom is being taken away in these last days too. But during this time, if you stood up for Bible truth and for Jesus, you would have been put to death in the Catholic countries. So this is the reason, and that went on for 1260 years, except from the 1500s that power was broken in some parts of the world. that power was broken. So we are forming a basis for the next study, in which we'll complete Daniel chapter 11. And we'll get into the meat of the chapter now that we understand the principles that will give us the correct understanding of what we are going to study next. Thank you.